Ackerman, Commissioner of the Big East. Welcome back to our AMA. You and I spoke back in May when this global pandemic hit. We were joined by my co-founder, Angela Ruggiero. We swapped Angela out for Scott. How's that? Okay? An improvement?
That worked out great.
I love Angela, but I like Scott a lot. So
there you go. Great to see you again. Thanks for joining us. Scott and I are going to ask you a bunch of different questions about how we get out of this mess. But to recap sort of what you and I discussed back in May, we're just starting to get our arms around what was happening. And you outlined that there were really three things that put the Big East in a unique position. One, you had event cancellation, pandemic insurance. Two, you were starting to have a pretty good outlook on how cost savings might keep the Big East in a good position because you're not actually spending as much money in this situation. And then the third was that there were some reserves, that there was some money that you had been strategically cultivating for a while. It's been a few months since we talked. Have things played out the way that you had anticipated?
Thanks, Josh. The answer is yes. All of those things that you outlined happened for us. We did have cancellation insurance for the Big East tournament at the Garden. We were able to collect on a claim. We had a very good outcome there, as a matter of fact. I'll note that we have 2 more years of coverage under that policy for communicable diseases. It's sort of a little less clear how it would apply in years 2 and 3, but our folks did a good job of getting that bound earlier this year so we could avail ourselves of it following the events in March. And as you noted, we do have a reserve fund, which really was made up of some leftover money, if you will, from when the conference was reconfigured 7 years ago. There were some contributions there that we didn't need to access when the conference restarted in 2013.
Mm-hmm.
So that came in handy. And then, yes, I think every conference, despite the revenue hits that we've all taken, have had savings because of events that didn't happen and the costs that are associated with those. So that all came to be. And now, frankly, we're in multiple budget models for this year because that, for us, extends through June, and we don't know how things are going to play out over the next few months. So our board has kind of allowed us to operate off of some different contingency models at the moment.
And the contingency models, as you just alluded to, play out for the first 6 months. You're not trying to be more forward-looking than that and doing an annual budget. Is that what you?
Well, we do an annual budget. We actually have often like a 3 or 5 year outlook is kind of how we try to model things out. And, for us, a league like ours, we don't sponsor football. We sponsor 22 sports. Football's not one. So our revenues are principally generated from the sport of basketball. So for us, our really ending the season is more important in many ways than starting it. And, particularly with the rocky start we've all had with cancellations and the like. But for us, if we can play the Big East tournament, if we have a solid number of games on television, that helps us with our media revenues. And then importantly, the NCAA tournament is a big funding source for all the conferences because of the way that the economics work there. The money comes in mostly from television. There's some gate money, which will probably get wiped out this year if the tournament's held without fans. But then the TV revenues, mostly they pay for some costs, but then mostly get redistributed back out to the schools and the conferences. So if March Madness happens this year, it's a good outcome in a lot of ways. But one of them, importantly, is how that will affect conference budgets come next June.
Hey, Val, is it difficult to convince people to leave the rainy day fund alone? There is that desire, oftentimes there's that desire to tap it for whatever use there might be. But as you see now, it's nice to sort of have that on the balance sheet.
Well, the middle ground there, Scott, is not between not taking any of it and saving it for the next rainy day, and taking all of it was sort of taking part of it. And that's basically what we did. We didn't empty the account when we accessed it this past spring, but our schools had budgeted for a certain financial outcome this year, and so it was their view that we could give basically a short-term fix to our school by taking some of that money down. The board wanted to make sure we had a replenishment plan for the reserves fund, so that will affect sort of what we do going forward. And there's some cost savings we think we can affect in future years as we, again, sort of refill the coffer, if you will, on the reserve fund. But again, what really helped us was being able to access insurance funds from our event cancellation policy. And then, as I noted, we did have some savings in the spring because we wiped out our spring sport calendar and the costs that are associated with that for not only event operation, but what we would put on our digital network and so on. So at the end of the day, I think our conference made out pretty well for fiscal 1920. And then, as I noted, for 2021, how things turn out in basketball will really be the driver for us in terms of, where we land in June.
Can I ask you a basic management question that I'm getting in a new position of overseeing a staff of 18 or so? How are you checking in with your folks? How are you making sure you're touching in with them? And how are you doing? How are you coping? Just very basic, but you have a big organization. You can't, I would think, speak to every person every day, but I know you're probably trying to at least keep a pulse there.
Well, Scott, we're doing it the same way we are today, like by this, lots of calls by Zoom. Thank goodness for Zoom. It's allowed us to see each other, even though we can't be together. So, for us, I have a conference office staff. We have weekly meetings with everybody. We have units, so the unit heads have probably daily meetings with their folks. And then I have a senior staff that's twice a week by Zoom, and then offline, lots of one-on-one calls, if you will. And then, every conference has been having since March regular meetings with ADs, multiple times a week in some cases. Other stakeholder groups, for example, our senior women administrators have a significant management role in our league with Olympic sport management and women's basketball. Our compliance folks have been on overdrive because the NCAA has had to adjust to sort of, COVID with, quote, emergency legislation, as we've tried to create flexibility for schools and conferences to deal with the pandemic and what outcomes are being created for student athletes. And then, obviously, last but certainly not least, you have to have a channel to deal with your presidents, your board. And so I think I've had in the last 8 months probably close to 20 gatherings of our presidents. They normally meet 3 times a year as a group, and we've had 20 meetings because of the volume and the pace of issues that are in front of us, and because of the decisions that we've had to consider and ultimately make as it related to our fall sports, which we postponed to the spring, and then decisions we've made around basketball, and then what we have to do for the condensing of our sports in the second semester this year. So there's just been a whole host of reasons to bring the board together, and that's been, by Zoom as well. So we're doing it electronically. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative, which would be no communication or doing it by phone, frankly.
And Val, when you look across the different, conferences or even, sports properties in the professional level, when you see some of the cuts that other executives are making and the decisions that they're doing, do you feel like, if you were looking at a continuum, that they're more on the side of conservative, viewpoints and operations, or have they gone too extreme in your perspective? When you look back at May, when you and I were trying to predict like what was going to happen over the next 6 months, what do you think you're observing about the decision making that boards are making, presidents are making, other commissioners are making? Is it really severe stuff, or do you think that they have a more optimistic outlook for 2021?
Probably a little of both, Josh. I mean, I think it has been a very harsh year for higher ed. I mean, our presidents have had to deal with massive questions about, enrollment, about how to manage COVID on their campuses, how to deal with the fallout from that, from a financial standpoint, from a student athlete, in the case of college sports, student athlete wellness standpoint, student body standpoint, how to manage your faculty. And they've been kind of in crisis management mode, to be honest, since March. So athletics is really just a microcosm of the bigger issues that our presidents have had to deal with on campus. So just speaking for myself, I've tried to be very respectful of where we fit into this sort of this bigger, mosaic of issues that they have to manage through. And I really feel for our presidents. I'm very sympathetic and trying to make sure, I keep athletics in its place in a way. But in a league like ours, athletics is really important. Basketball's part of the identity of our group of schools. It matters for reasons that, you can count on many two hands. And so our presidents have been and remain very engaged in it. As it relates to your point, it really varies from school to school, the extent of adjustment in terms of, costs that have to be cut, managed, what has to be cut, what can be held on to, how, short-term your thinking has to be as opposed to what are you thinking about for next year. In our case, we've had schools that have managed their academic calendars sort of continuously. Most of our schools aren't coming back in terms of their student populations until later in January. So our campuses are pretty much cleared out right now, which does, we think, make basketball more feasible in terms of being able to play games. And then I think now everybody's got to think about the future. And I can't tell you where our schools are on, what they're thinking about for the next academic year. And that's really the problem with the virus. It just made it very hard to plan. I mean, our business in sports is so calendarized.
Yeah, and especially when everything gets jammed up in the middle. Yeah, understood.
Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen in a few weeks, so it's been very challenging.
Well, let's turn to recalibration as to the reliance on sports. Are some schools saying, "Ooh, boy, if we didn't have any football revenue, maybe decisions would have been different if there wasn't this reliance on that revenue, not only in the athletic department, but what some of those departments provide to the university as well?"
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there has been recalibration, Scott. You have had no choice because you have to make budgets work, and you have to be very attentive to health and safety, and have to be very, I think, responsible and thoughtful about the decisions you're making and why you're making them and when you have to make them. So, I mean, I'll use we don't have football, as I noted. We have 4 schools that play football. We don't sponsor it as a league. But we do have 6, for us, we have 6 fall sports that we run championships for. And we did have an agonizing summer throughout June and July and into August, trying to decide whether we thought those sports could be safely conducted. And so we kind of had to look at everything. I mean, we looked at where the virus was. We looked at what the testing requirements were in the minds of our doctors. We have a medical group that all conferences have. We have our own. We looked at travel feasibility, and so we had to put all that into sort of the blender and come up with a decision. And we ended up deciding to postpone. But we took it as long as we could. And why did it wait so long? Because our schools wanted to give it the best shot. They thought they could do it for a while. And then it came to the point where we had to decide. We had to let those athletes and coaches know what was going on. So yeah, we had a major recalibration in our league in terms of moving those sports to the spring. And then we sort of had to pick up on basketball and, of course, follow the NCAA's lead when they decided to move the season back by 2 weeks. Dr. Hainline, their medical director, has been really helpful in coming up with guidance that has been a resource for all the conferences in terms of testing and other protocols. And so we've looked to them for a lot of what our plan is relies on what the NCAA came up with. We have our own medical experts. So yeah, we've been recalibrating sort of all the time. And now with our schedule underway, we've had to recalibrate almost daily because of changes in our game schedule that are brought on by, by quarantines, for example, and other factors. So it's been just one nonstop recalibration, to be honest. But we're doing the best we can to do what I call, competent reaction. And I think that's really going to be our MO for the next few months. I mean, Josh, you mentioned, I think at the top, what's going to get us out of this. I think it's the vaccine. is going
Yeah.
to get us all out of this, but that's not going to affect our world, I don't think, this academic year. I think it's going to help us starting next year, 21, 22, realistically. So I think whatever we do this year is just going to be, the best we can and probably a little bit on the fly.
So let's try to. So you remember the drill. It's an Ask Me Anything. So our audience is already starting to ask questions. So you're going to have to start bouncing around a little bit like a basketball pretty soon here. Scott and I could ask you questions all hour, but that's not what this is designed to do. Before I turn to the questions that are coming in, very quickly on a high note, because I like to wrap on these topics on a positive. What do you, when you look back over the last few, competent reactions that you've made, have you guys really looked at it as like, hey, this is a silver lining for what we had to do. We operate more efficiently now because of XYZ. What do you look to as like a really nice, pin you can put in this thing and say, during COVID, the Big East figured this out?
Well, I would say a positive has been the reentry of UConn into the Big East.
Yeah.
That probably would have been a bigger story if not for COVID. But I will say that's been it's just amazing to have them back.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wish it wasn't under such fraught circumstances, but to have everything they're bringing in terms of the history and the geography and the rivalries and stuff, maybe it'll be delayed gratification. And we won't. Really
And you're bringing the women's tournament to Connecticut, right?
Yeah.
So
And
that's
the women's
big news
tournament's
too.
gone
Yeah.
there, and so yeah, that the UConn piece has been great. I do think it has brought our staff closer together because we've had no choice but to try to make do, as I mentioned earlier.
Right.
And I'm proud of my group. I think our ADs have gotten very close to one another because they've had to get together often and exchange notes, and they're a collegial group. So I think we've tried to create sort of a family ethic within the Big East, and I think that's alive and well. Whether it's our ADs, our coaches, certainly our staffs. So I think that's a plus. I do think, to your point, sort of how we do things is going to get readjusted. I mean, I just look at all the time I've spent over the years getting on an airplane and traveling somewhere for a 2-hour meeting.
Right.
Filling a day or two for a 2-hour in-person meeting.
Will you be doing less of that, Val?
I think
Will that
so.
be
I
will
would
that be
like
part
to.
of personal change after a while that you don't have to do that?
Yeah, I mean, and the wear and tear, Scott, that puts on all of us. I mean, it's one thing to go to a game or the Final Four or, some in-person event that is sort of, an athletic contest, but the travel that we do for meetings, it does get, in our line of work, I mean, we travel, weekly, and a lot of it, I think, can be cut back now, and Zoom may be our savior, in many ways, after all. Not to eliminate completely this in-person stuff, because I think that is a key part of our line of work. But I think to cut back on it in some way, I think can be a positive.
So Mark asks, and this falls under the umbrella of make goods and corporate partnerships and your role in maintaining those and obviously keeping everybody feeling good about the future of the Big East. Mark asks, how is the conference and how are member schools managing those relationships with corporate partners at this stage?
Trying to take the long view, I think, is probably where we all are. I mean, I'll just use our sponsors as an example. We have our own assets to sell. It's principally our championships. As I mentioned, we sponsor 22 sports. So our principal asset would be the conference championships for those sports, most notably our men's basketball tournament at Madison Square Garden. That didn't get played or got played only partially. So that was a bit of a hit for us because the value was not fully transmitted with an incomplete event there. But the good news for us is that, we were, our partners were understanding. They wanted to stick with us. They know that's a great event when it happens. And so with the help of our marketing agent, which is Fox Sports College Properties, we were able to work out kind of an arrangement. I mean, we settled with them on what we did deliver versus what we didn't deliver. And the good news is they're all sort of sticking with us because they do know that once that event is back and back on track, it will be what they bargained for. So I think, on our campuses, it's the same, it's the same process. So I do think it's about communication. People are pretty understanding in this environment. This wasn't our fault. It's no one's fault that COVID happened, in the way it's affected our business. So I think it is about taking the long view, having good communication, and just being understanding, that everybody's going to have to suffer some pain here as you work out sort of the near-term financial impact about that. But hopefully, again, we're all bullish that once hopefully the vaccine hits, we'll be back on track and we can get back to something of a more normal state in terms of what we as a property can deliver, and then what the partners, can reasonably expect to get out of that relationship.
Well, speaking of fault and pain, we have seen a number of athletic departments cut programs. So we wrote a piece a while back in speaking with economists that said the way to actually add money to your program is to add programs. A bit of an iconoclast think there. Your thoughts on the knee-jerk reaction of save money, cut program, or is there a better way?
I think it's complex, Scott. I don't think there's really an easy sort of way to describe the thought process that would go behind an athletic department making that hard call. We haven't had that yet in the Big East through this. So and I don't think it would be my place to speak to why any other school might have made that decision. I will note the economics of college sports are, sort of directed to sort of two revenue streams in terms of specific sports. It really is football and men's basketball that are bringing in the funding that's paying for most everything else. I mean, women's basketball brings in a little bit of revenue, but it's got a high cost structure because of Title IX, so it's not a profitable sport. If you compare revenues attributable and expenses attributable and net it out. So it isn't, it's not ideal economics here. And so I think athletic departments really do work hard to try to make connect the dots, make ends meet. I do think there could be some untapped revenue streams, for Olympic sports, for example, in philanthropy. I think every female student athlete, for example, should be given back to her alma mater for the scholarship that made her education possible, and I'm not sure athletic departments are always mining, opportunities like that, like those. But again, I don't, I think I wouldn't be quick to judge is all I would say here on why departments are making these decisions. I do know that Title IX is top of mind for every AD when they make these decisions because, they do have to be mindful of what their compliance requirements are under that very important piece of legislation. And so when those decisions are made, I wouldn't assume that hasn't been thought out carefully. I believe in most cases it has been. And hopefully, again, if we get back on track, those kinds of harsh results may be less frequent than we seem to be seeing right now.
And Val, last time we talked, you were, I think, just weeks out from when you published your NIL paper. I think it was with Gene Smith, correct? And you guys had just made that available. Lawrence asks a question very much along the lines of name, image, and likeness, and he says, how do you view the fact that athletes want to get paid, and what is the philosophy of board? How does that affect the philosophy of what boards are saying versus individual gain? Not sure what that last part is, but like if we focus on, your philosophy and the way that you directed the NIL initiative across college sports, can you just touch on that very briefly for everybody, give them an update on where we're at?
Yeah, sure, Josh. So you're right. In April, a working group that I co-chaired with Gene Smith, who's the athletics director at Ohio State, in that report, we did recommend that the NCAA modify its current rules relating to NIL, which are prohibitive. Our group had about 20 people. They represented all three divisions, included presidents, commissioners, ADs, some student athletes. And we really did think the time was now to open up this area and make opportunities that previously have not been available to student athletes available. So we came up with a framework for that. It wasn't a complete framework because it required details, which have since been largely worked out, but there's still some left. That would involve NIL opportunities for student athletes through either business activities that they're part of, for example, businesses they start and want to use their name to promote the business, or sort of the more standard commercial endorsement arrangements, be they sort of traditional endorsement deals, or more importantly, social media opportunities, which have been exploding young
So
people.
let's try to combine the last two things we discussed. One is Title IX, which is equitable distribution of sports across gender, making sure that, everybody is funded and there's an equal opportunity there. How do you maintain the same sort of equitable opportunity around name, image, and likeness for women athletes that perhaps don't get the same media exposure and other opportunities that the male athletes do?
Well, just to, this framework the payments to be made to the athletes will come from third parties. So in many respects, this will be a market-driven system because the schools are not the ones making the payments. And because of that, Title IX will not apply in the same way.
It won't apply, but the same reasons it
It won't
exists, right? Are sort
Well,
yeah.
where it will apply is that schools will have to make equitable for example, education opportunities that they would avail, that they would make available to their student athletes so they can responsibly navigate the NIL marketplace.
Yeah.
That will be expected. Schools will be providing those services, and those would have to be equitably delivered. But in terms of marketplace outcomes, it may well be that a women's athlete does better in the NIL marketplace than a male athlete, or an Olympic sport athlete does better than a football player. That's a marketplace.
It would be really cool. Yeah, it would be really
Josh,
cool to
I
see.
dropped a link into our op-ed from today. We had an op-ed from Caden Smith. Now, I don't expect anybody to know who that is. He's a football player at Appalachian State. So we're not talking Trevor Lawrence that everybody will concede could make millions of dollars in an open market, likely. But I really encourage folks to go read it because he takes you through the thought process of sort of your standard college athlete and how he thinks this will benefit or what he could do. The big decision for him is, because you got an extra year because of COVID, do I return for another season and take advantage of NIL? Just think this thought process that perhaps we're not thinking about because we're not in their shoes.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
I think again, you see a lot of the platforms allowing them to, build their brands outside of obviously the branding that they need from their schools to do that. So it would, you see this next generation really thinking like entrepreneurs. So that doesn't shock me. And to Val's point, Val, it would be awesome if the local car dealerships and the local banks turned to the female athletes before they do the male athletes. That would just be like so much evidence that there's that pent up market demand for that sport and for those athletes.
and I think that's very much a possibility, Josh. That's why I think this is a boon. This will be a boon for not just the athletes you'd expect, the star quarterback or the star point guard, men's basketball point guard, but I do think athletes who have, marketable attributes.
Mm-hmm. Their personality,
whatever,
right?
yeah, Instagram sensations,
Mm-hmm.
or, are people that brands want to be associated with for a whole host of reasons that are personality driven, perhaps not just athletics driven. Really, things can open up for them in some very, very exciting ways. So I think some real, will this be complicated and challenging to implement in the college space? Yes, very much so. That's why it's taken so long to kind of work out the, legislation around this and how this is going to work, and, what the compliance ramifications are going to be. But I think at the end of the day, it will turn out to be a transformational event.
Well, on the topic of brand, perfect segue into Brendan's question, which is very complimentary. The Big East is an awesome brand. So when it comes to branding, and this is a really interesting question, I think, for commissioners, what are the emotions you want to elicit from your fan base when they think of the Big East? What does that brand stand for?
I hope that it stands for, respect, sort of a toughness, if you will. I think the reputation of the Big East as a basketball matter was sort of hard-nosed, basketball, very physical play, hard games to ref, maybe a scuffle or two, as these rivalries sort of hit fever pitch, particularly in the mid 80s, when I think that the league was really hitting its zenith, and you saw teams hitting the Final Four, the coaches that this league was built on, Coach Carnesecca, Coach Thompson, Coach Massimino, Coach Boeheim. I think we're really iconic and really have become sort of legendary for us. So that was frankly one of the reasons I was so excited about this opportunity, is because I had such great respect for what the Big East represented as a basketball brand, particularly growing up in the Northeast, where basketball is such a, powerful sport. And when when I sort of started in this role and we did some early research, it really was clear that reputation for the Big East was kind of still going strong a few years ago. So I think we've been able to keep that going. Obviously, we have, different members than when Dave Gavitt started this league in '79. We've got the Midwest schools now who have their own proud basketball histories. Schools like Butler and Creighton and Xavier. I mean, they've got all glorious pasts in this sport. And so I think we've been able to create some exciting new rivalries there. But I think it's that, it's that basketball toughness, and then everything our presidents care about in terms of academic accomplishment. We do very well in the classroom, really second only to the Ivy and the Patriot in terms of graduation rates and other metrics there. And then our schools, being mostly Catholic schools, are real service driven. So having sort of a whole person, ethic about how to develop athletes, into young adults in terms of the service and the community piece of that is really meaningful to our schools. So, it's sort of a mouthful, I guess.
It's a mouthful, but it's really good. I think you hit on everything.
I think it holds together.
It does hold together.
Coming from a Syracuse guy who went there in the late '80s, I'm not sure if Syracuse is so happy in the ACC. I miss those Georgetown-Syracuse battles.
Yeah.
Well, they're still playing each other, Scott, which is great.
Yeah. And I think of you, Scott, as like a fast, tough, gritty street ball, Big East guy.
Yeah, that's me, Josh. Right.
That's you in a nutshell. But Val, on that front, like, again, just as a commissioner, do you treat it like you're a CEO and you need to do this brand work and you need to bring that message together for the schools that have their own identities and give them something to point to for their sponsors and for their brands that they work with?
Yeah, we do. We have worked hard to, again, perpetuate this, the basketball centricity of the conference. The Fox relationship's been critically important for us. And, when I took over, the new 12-year deal that had been struck with Fox Sports that puts every one of our men's basketball games on linear television was handed to me. And we've, I think, successfully brought that relationship to life. So I want to laud our colleagues and partners at Fox for pushing us. I think early on they were using the tagline, "the soul of college basketball," as a way to describe the Big East, which I thought was kind of cool. The name carries so much equity. And so we haven't even changed the logo. I mean, I've thought about, should we modernize the Big East logo? It's the third or fourth iteration of that, but I haven't touched it. And I don't know, maybe won't, because of the history that's sort of embedded in that. And then I think being able to keep playing the tournament at the Garden just means a lot to us. I mean, we've been there for 38 years. I think right now the longest, running college basketball tournament venue relationship in our space. It's a great event. I mean, we 2 years ago entered into an extension with MSG. I mean, we're locked and loaded to be there for another 8 years. And that was so important to our schools to be able to have that place, the magic of that building. So I think all those elements, Josh, sort of come into play in terms of what we are. And, again, UConn was sort of the icing on the cake because they kind of fit into all that, the history, the toughness, the geography, the Garden. We're going to send, when fans are allowed, many thousands of, people down to be at the Garden for, their return. So I think all that's the package. And we have tried to build branding around that. We had our 40th, last but not least, we had our 40th anniversary last year, 2019. And we had a cool party around that up in Providence, where Dave got this, all going. So I'm very respectful of history. I really, I don't want to, it's not everything, but it can be very meaningful. And I think we've got a proud history to tout. So as long as I'm in this position, I'm going to keep playing that up.
Well, I have a little wry smile, Val, because you talked about history. If I close my eyes and I was listening to you, I can hear the thread of David Stern in the back there. And we're coming up on almost a year since David passed. I'm just curious what you think he would do with the Big East, with basketball right now, because you were talking about the opportunities for athletes with technology. They can go direct to consumer. What's next? David was always looking at what's next. Where do I need to be? And I know because you worked for him for so long, you too like to look down the road. What's next? Where do I need to be? Bring that David part of the brain to life for me here. And where are we going with the Big East in basketball?
Well, I think you read my mind, Scott. I mean, David's in my thoughts often. It's an honor to work for him, learn from him, and he's deeply missed. Many a time in the last year, I would have called him, said, like, what do we do with this? But to your point, I mean, the areas where I can hear him in my ear, and I know I'm not doing enough on, are the ones that come to mind and I think about for the Big East, although we're not in the same spot that the NBA is, would be technology. There's more to be done there, I know, and so that's on the list. How can we bring technology to bear in a bigger way in college basketball and for us in the Big East? Some of that's resource driven, which is, sometimes tricky, but I think we have to be maybe sort of thinking in a better way, in a more aggressive way on that score. International, I've often wondered if there's a bigger opportunity for intercollegiate athletics to grow globally. I've had some discussions with Mark Emmert about this because our system is unique in the world. There isn't any place else in the world that has a university sports system like ours. And I know, because I've gotten inquiries, that that's of interest in other countries. And I often wonder, can we be a model for some other countries as they build out that university sports platform? But for now, we're basically a domestic business. DE&I, was David, cared deeply about diversity, and having the NBA and WNBA ultimately be a force as it related to gender and racial equity. And so that is top of mind for me all the time. And as long as I'm doing this, I'm going to push to make sure that that women and our black colleagues, whether they're coaches or administrators, other people of color, have an opportunity to be in the leader ranks of college sports in a way that matches up with our athlete populations. We're not nowhere near close, and I'm glad I have friends like Dr. Richard Lapchick to push all of us in the business on the importance of continuing our efforts there. And then it's just sort of back to basketball. I mean, what can I do as a commissioner to sort of keep our teams at a high level, because we do care deeply about being relevant, successful. Thank God, for schools like Villanova that have proven that a league like ours can punch through and make it to the, to the brass ring. And so there's a mix of factors there that, I will confess. Yeah, David is, when I think about all those, sort of, he's in the back of my head, sort of with my, what would David do bracelet on. I think about what he, counsel he would give in all those areas.
I warned Scott that I would bring this up, so this isn't a surprise to him, but you just touched on a number of factors that, Sports Innovation Lab is using to determine who the most innovative sports properties are in the world. Diversity and inclusion, technology alignment, the ability to be international and have that global reach. Those are all things that David cared about deeply. I had the honor of getting to know him over the last few years, especially through his work with me here at Live Like, one of these companies that's trying to, innovate the fan experience through viewership. Davion over at Shot Tracker, where he's doing all kinds of motion tracking and data collection on the court. That tech community misses him so much. So it is one of these things that I think when we get to this year anniversary, we are all taking a pause and looking back at, like, are we being honest about how hard we're pushing the industry forward? And so what I want to do is ask you very specifically, beyond the things you just touched on, when you look at another property or another sports organization broadly, who do you look to as a model? Like, who do you say, if we could be more like what they're doing, we'd be in a much better place? Do you have that North Star? Do you have that other organization that you say to your team, hey, I want us to emulate what these guys are doing because they figured something out?
Well, I would say that in, intercollegiate athletics, we all look to, to the A5. I mean, the Autonomy 5 conferences, for leadership, for guidance. I know all their commissioners, of course, and I'm excited for the ACC because Jim Phillips is a really great guy. And I'm glad he's having his moment here. I think he can really be an asset at the commissioner level. And so we pay close attention to what they're doing, certainly in our space. And then I have, sort of great respect generally for all my commissioner colleagues. I mean, they're all smart. Many of them know more than I do about the college space. And I'm often listening on conference calls we have together. So I'm still learning from commissioner colleagues in the NCAA. I think at the pro level, we keep our eye as well on really all the pro leagues. I mean, I have great respect for all the commissioners. I'm good friends with several of them. And certainly in basketball, I think Adam's done a really terrific job of picking up the mantle from David and taking it even further. I had a conversation the other day with Kathy Engelbert at the WNBA, and of course, looking forward to the 25th anniversary next year. Hard to believe, of the WNBA, and I'm glad to see the impact that they made this year. They leaned in hard on racial equity, and that's I'm glad it was noticed.
Yeah, there was data just released that during the pandemic, a lot of the women's sports and had outsized viewership, and that was one of the silver linings that from a researcher's perspective, we look at and we say, look, there's pent up demand here. With more exposure, with better visibility for these athletes in these sports, there's something to be gained in this environment. For
Yeah.
sure.
And then I think, I kind of hope to sort of stay involved in whatever events, and competitions and leagues and platforms develop in the future. And I think, Josh, Angela, and I, good friend Angela Ruggiero, have often talked about the possibility of a WNHL. So I hope, those sorts of endeavors, kind of happen. And I think anybody who's involved in women's sports will be looking to the pro leagues, current and future, for just some inspiration.
Val, at least on the marketing side, increasingly leagues, teams are plucking personnel from outside of sports. Do you look primarily first for someone with sports experience, or are you two increasingly looking outside of the sports world for somebody with a different take on the business?
Scott, my staff at the conference is a mix. I mean, I have folks there who have worked primarily in pro sports. I certainly put myself in that category, although I had some other experiences that I could bring to bear on this. Importantly, I've got a number of folks on my staff who have come out of the college sports world, and I will say it's helpful, particularly if you're coming from a campus. Because to have people who understand what our athletics directors, what our external operations personnel are doing, what that compliance piece looks like, it is a different animal. I mean, there is some overlap between the college sports world and the pro leagues. There's some, particularly at the higher levels of college sports, where the commercial outcomes are, kind of comparable and the issues are similar. But there's a lot of difference, and it's kind of a world unto itself. So I have kind of, in fact, had to learn a bit how important it is to have people on my staff that have that background, because, I've had to learn it in the last 7 years. There's things I still don't know and, can't represent well. So, but I think beyond that, it is helpful if you can sprinkle within your organization somebody who's got a tech background or a digital background or a marketing background. Certainly there's always room for really smart people who can pick things up quickly and help you think outside the box. College sports, it's not always easy to move an idea through the system. It is kind of a complex bureaucracy, I've found, sometimes frustratingly so. And it doesn't pride itself on nimbleness always. So even if you had a great idea, it does take a lot of effort to get it, sort of pulled through the system. And that sometimes can be very frustrating. And requires sort of an extra level of persistence and powers of persuasion. But I think, we can certainly stand more of that, sort of that outside influence, in our world. And I do hope that happens, whether it's at the NCAA office or at the conference level or at our school.
I noticed you didn't say finance as one of those 10 polls, but do you get the sense the finance folks are peeking behind the curtain, understanding the revenue opportunities in college athletics and saying, maybe we could get involved here?
Well, I mean, I was remiss in not identifying the importance of that function. I mean, of course, it's critically important to have good financial people. I've got a great business officer, Kevin Flanagan, who works on my staff, works closely with the business officers of our schools. And the NCAA, Kathleen McNeely, is the CFO and has been really an asset for the national office and is minding a significant budget of her own. So yeah, the finances are critically important and have been altered by COVID. And I just kind of want to go back to something that Josh said. I mean, some of these ideas that I mentioned that I think are back of mind, because, in part because of my experience with David Stern, have had to be back burner just because we're all trying to get through the year. I would say that's been the challenge of this year. It is hard to look ahead right now. I mean, you have to, as a leader, think about tomorrow. You can't just think about today, but it's really hard to get past the day in some days here, just as we try to survive in advance. But I do think the effective leaders in our business are not just thinking about, okay, how am I going to get through the next couple of weeks or through the basketball season or the academic year, but how do I, maintain at least one eye on what's going to happen next year and what the 5-year outlook is going to be and what those new business opportunities are going to look like and how we're going to get technology thought out with all these advancements and so on. And I just would confess, sometimes there's just not enough hours in a day to get to all of that, but it is important and certainly on our list.
Well, we're getting down to the bottom of the hour, so I'm going to let you off the hook here pretty quick. But one more question that does require you to look out a little bit, but I'm sure you're thinking quite a bit about, comes from a number of people, Michael and Brendan and others that have asked it. How are you thinking about sports gambling? We talked about Connecticut. They are on the cusp of trying to legalize gambling. It's a big conversation there. Where is it in the college world? And from your perspective, given your tenure with the different commissioners and the presidents that, have to view this either as a lightning rod or a revenue opportunity, where are we?
I would say at the moment, the focus has been on, in the college world, knowing it can't be stopped. I mean, it's happening.
It's coming. Yes.
It's coming. It has come, and it's still coming in some states. I think most states within the near future are going to have some legalized sports betting framework. In the college space, the focus really is on education of the athletes at this point. They're not allowed to gamble. People associated with our programs aren't allowed to bet on any sport that the NCAA sponsors. There is a concern about integrity. There is a concern about undue influence on athletes and coaches.
Is there a commission that gives you guys some sort of arm's length from this? Is there anybody within college that's working on this so that they can help the different conferences, navigate these issues?
No, Josh, it's really an institution by institution basis. I mean, they're the ones that are closest to the athletes and the coaches. And so they offer education about, just being careful, making sure that the people surrounding the team aren't kind of, inadvertently disclosing information that could be used by someone, with ill intent. If you will, that could, affect the line, and making sure our student athletes are basically protected. That's really been the focus right now.
So not a big fan of unnecessary bureaucracy, but the NIL stuff you worked on required like a focused initiative and effort. What's the trigger that's going to do that for sports betting, where there's a group that goes off and is independently making this recommendation for college, for college sports?
Well, it's really, the NCAA has its own, rules that are prohibitive about, again, student athletes placing bets or people associated with the team doing the same. And there really at this point hasn't been, frankly, much guidance coming at all from the NCAA. It's really been left to conferences and schools to manage. And again, it's really been mostly in the form of education about undue influence on programs.
Hey, Josh, it's crawl, walk, run. Crawl was, let's get a data deal first. We all know what the value of data is these days, and I believe that the NCAA signed up with Genius Sports. That's crawl. As those values mushroom, I think we're going to get into the walking phase will be short-lived, and we'll be running pretty soon.
Yeah, I just, again, you see it in the fragmented approach of the legalization. It's going to come from different institutions, and if they have to figure this stuff out on their own, we're in a bigger mess. Val, that's it from me. Scott, do you have anything else that you want to hit on?
No, as you always say, right at the end of these, we like to give the guest the last word if there's something that they would like to say that we perhaps missed. Go ahead, Val. The floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thanks guys for having me. Really appreciate this. I will say for college sports right now, it's a really important time. I mean, it seems like it always is, but this confluence of really big issues, that are happening are all hitting at once in ways that I don't think anyone can, as they come together, no one can predict really where we'll be in a year. I mean, you've got the recovery from COVID. We have NIL, as has been noted. We have the possibility of, not certainty, of congressional intervention as it relates to NIL or perhaps a broader array of issues relating to college sports. We have transfer rules that may be not on anyone's radar screens, but transfer rules are likely to change in sports right now, where there's a year of residency required for an athlete can play after transfer is likely to become a one-time immediate eligibility exception. So that could have massive implications competitively for a sport like football or men's basketball. We have DE&I that has sort of hit our industry generally in a massive way over the last 8 or 9 months in an important way. And so I think schools and conferences have to be very responsive to what that means for the diversification of their workforces, as well as what it means for the activism of their student athletes. And then, again, as you all noted, you have this all kind of embedded within this financial structure that is, has some vulnerability. And so, the volume and the pace of all of these issues right now is pretty breathtaking, to be honest. And I don't have a crystal ball here on how this all gets sort of worked out and brought together in the coming year, and what part of it will be managed from within versus externally imposed. And then, of course, the litigation, on top of everything. So I think it is a very dynamic and challenging time in college sports, but I'm happy to be in this line of work because I think we're doing a lot of good. I wouldn't be here today if I
was
wasn't.
going to say, if you end up by saying I'm happy to be in this line of work after that list of issues.
But I wouldn't be here if I wasn't. I played basketball at UVA, and I wouldn't be sitting in this job talking to you guys if I hadn't had that experience. So I think that makes me remorseful that the good work, that's done on our campuses and the benefits that come to these athletes isn't always brought to the fore. But
well, I know I speak for Scott when I say that's exactly why we had you on, because you have the whole view. You're looking at all the issues, and there's very few people in this industry that can navigate these waters as well as you. Val, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great. Thanks so much, guys. I appreciate it.
Val.
Happy holidays.
You too. Be well.